She'd traveled 1,200 miles for a promise. What she found was a graveyard. The smoke was a bitter ghost on the Nebraska wind, still whispering from the blackened bones of what was supposed to be her home, her future, her safety. Catherine Walsh, 26 years old and a world away from the Philadelphia boarding house she'd fled, stood on the edge of a nightmare. The cabin Samuel Morrison had described in his letters, the one he'd expanded just for her, was a pile of charred timber and scorched earth. The barn was a skeleton. The prairie grass for miles around was trampled and stained. She'd stepped off the train in Kearney 3 days ago, her heart a flutter of hope and fear. A man she'd never met was supposed to be there, a tall, kind man with a beard who wrote of loneliness and the beauty of a prairie sunrise. But Samuel Morrison wasn't at the station. He was just gone, and his dream was ash. Now, after a bone-jarring wagon ride with a kind stranger who knew Samuel, she was here, standing in the ruins of a life that hadn't even had a chance to begin. The silence was the worst part, a dead, heavy silence where there should have been the lowing of cattle, the clucking of chickens, the sound of a man's footsteps. But the silence was a lie. Catherine took a step closer to the ruin of the main cabin, her worn leather boots sinking into the soft, gray ash. Something was wrong. The destruction was too perfect, too angry. This wasn't a prairie fire. This was a massacre. Tom Parker, the neighbor who'd brought her here, had found the tracks, horses, lots of them, and signs of a fight, a desperate, brutal fight. Then she saw it. Near the collapsed chimney, half hidden by a fallen roof beam, was a heavy wooden door set flat into the ground, a root cellar. It seemed untouched by the fire, an island of solid wood in a sea of destruction. But it wasn't the door itself that made her breath catch in her throat. It was the fresh scratches in the dirt around the edges. Someone had been here. Recently. "Tom," she called out, her voice a dry rasp. He came running, his face a mask of grim concern. Together they heaved the heavy door open. A wave of musty, damp air rolled out, thick with the smell of earth and something else. Fear. It was pitch black inside. Catherine leaned forward, peering into the darkness. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. "Is anyone down there?" For a long moment, there was nothing, just the lonely sigh of the wind across the prairie. She was about to turn away, to dismiss it as a trick of the light, a desperate hope. Then a sound, a tiny shuffling sound, the whimper of a terrified animal. And then she saw them. 8 pairs of hollow eyes glowing faintly in the gloom, staring back at her from the shadows. They weren't animals. They were children. Children hiding in the dark, their faces gaunt, their clothes torn to rags. The youngest, a little girl no older than 3, clutched a dirty corn husk doll. The oldest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 14, stood in front of the others, his body a frail shield. In his hand, a rusted knife trembled. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice cracking. "Don't hurt us." Catherine's heart didn't just break. It shattered into a million pieces. She had come here seeking a husband and a home. She had found a burned-out homestead, a missing fiancé, and 8 orphan souls who would die without her. She had barely enough money to last a week. Winter was coming, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. But as she looked at those 8 pairs of desperate eyes, a fire ignited in her chest. A fire hotter than the one that had consumed Samuel's home. It was a feeling she'd never known before. Not hope, not fear. It was rage. And in that moment, standing on the edge of a dark hole in the ground, Catherine Walsh made a choice. She didn't know it yet, but this choice wouldn't just change her destiny. It would change the face of the entire Nebraska territory. The mail-order bride was gone. Someone else was being born in the ashes. Someone much, much stronger. The ride back to Kearney was a silent, grim procession. Tom and Janet Parker, their faces etched with a mixture of pity and awe, had helped her coax the children out of the cellar. 8 of them. Marcus, the fierce 14-year-old protector. Lucy, 12, with eyes that had seen too much. Rebecca, 11, quiet and watchful. Michael, 9, who flinched at every sudden sound. Sarah, 7, who wouldn't let go of her twin brothers. Jacob and Joshua, who were 5. And little Emma, 3 years old, who hadn't spoken a single word. They weren't Samuel's children. They weren't even all siblings. They were the flotsam of a storm of violence that had swept across the prairie. Marcus, his voice a low monotone, told the story. Bad men. They'd come in the night, first to his family's homestead, then to others. They took what they wanted and burned the rest. The children had run, finding each other in the chaos, hiding in the woods and creeks until they stumbled upon Samuel's place, only to watch the horror repeat itself. They'd hidden in the root cellar, listening to the screams and the gunfire, and had been there for 3 days, surviving on preserved peaches and sheer terror. Their parents? Marcus's face was a stone mask. They wouldn't wake up, was all he said. They crowded into Catherine's small room at the Kearney Hotel, a huddled mass of silent trauma. Mrs. Crawford, the hotel owner, took one look at them, and her stern facade crumbled. She brought up a tray of stew and fresh bread, her eyes full of a sorrow that needed no words. The children ate like starving wolves, their hands shaking, their eyes darting toward the door with every footstep in the hall. Catherine sat on the edge of her bed watching them, the scale of her decision crashing down on her like a physical weight. She had $47 to her name, a single trunk of belongings, and 8 mouths to feed, 8 bodies to clothe, 8 broken souls to mend. What are you going to do, honey? Janet Parker asked softly, touching Catherine's shoulder. You can't keep them here. The church might take them, or send them to an orphanage back east. The thought was like a knife in her gut. An orphanage. To be separated, scattered to the winds after everything they had endured together. To be sent back east, to the crowded, cruel cities she had just escaped. No, absolutely not. They're not going to an orphanage, Catherine said, her voice low but fierce. They're staying with me. Janet stared at her, her expression unreadable. Catherine, be realistic. You're a single woman with no home, no income. Winter is just around the corner. Taking on 1 child would be a struggle. 8. It's impossible. Failure is not an option, Catherine whispered, repeating the words to herself as much as to Janet. She looked at Marcus, who had fallen asleep sitting up, his head leaning against the wall, but his hands still resting on the handle of that rusted knife. Even in sleep, he was ready to fight. How could she do any less? An idea, wild and reckless, began to form in her mind. An idea born of sheer desperation. We're not staying in town, she said, the plan solidifying as she spoke. We're going back. Back? Janet asked, confused. Back where? Catherine met her gaze, and for the first time since arriving in Nebraska, her eyes held not fear, but a cold, hard certainty. Back to the homestead, she said. We're going to rebuild. Janet looked at her as if she had lost her mind. Catherine, that land isn't yours. The cabin is gone, and the men who did this, they could still be out there. They could come back. Let them, Catherine said, and a grim smile touched her lips. This time, we'll be ready for them. The next morning, Catherine Walsh, a woman who had spent her life following rules and keeping her head down, walked into the Territorial Land Office and did the most audacious thing she had ever done. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed any head of household, including unmarried women, to claim 160 acres of public land. They had to live on it, build a home, and farm it for 5 years. Then it was theirs. Samuel Morrison's claim was void. He was missing, presumed dead. His land was once again public domain. The clerk, a balding man with a bored expression, looked at her over the top of his spectacles. Miss Walsh, do you have any concept of what you're proposing? You and, what was it, 8 children? You intend to build a homestead from scratch on a piece of land that was just the site of a massacre? Most men fail at this. You won't last a month. Catherine leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the counter. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the dusty air of the office like a razor. Sir, I am not most men, and those children have already survived worse than anything the prairie can throw at us. We are not asking for your opinion. We are filing a claim. Give me the papers. The clerk, taken aback by her intensity, simply slid the documents across the counter. As she signed her name, Catherine Walsh, head of household, She felt a profound shift inside her. She wasn't just claiming a piece of land. She was claiming a future. She was drawing a line in the dirt and daring the world to try and cross it. But as she walked out of that office, the signed papers clutched in her hand, a chilling thought struck her. The clerk had called it a massacre. Tom Parker had said it looked vindictive, personal. Why? Why would a band of raiders be so thorough, so full of rage? It wasn't just robbery, it was an execution. They hadn't just destroyed Samuel's home. They had tried to erase him from the face of the earth. And the terrifying question that echoed in her mind was, why? What was Samuel Morrison involved in that would bring such wrath down upon him? She had come west to marry an honest, hard-working farmer. But what if the man she only knew from letters was hiding a dangerous secret? A secret that was now buried with him in the ashes of their future? A secret that might still be waiting for her on that lonely patch of prairie? A secret that could get her and 8 innocent children killed? Getting back to the homestead was one thing. Surviving on it was another. The reality of their situation was a daily punch to the gut. They had no house, no livestock, and a dwindling supply of food purchased on credit from a sympathetic store owner in Kearney. Their only shelter was the root cellar, damp, dark, and crowded for 9 people. The first week was a blur of backbreaking labor and constant gnawing fear. Every snap of a twig, every howl of a distant coyote sent the younger children into a panic. Marcus rarely slept, circling their makeshift camp at night like a wary wolf, his rusted knife never leaving his side. Catherine knew they couldn't last long like this. They needed a real shelter before the first snow, and they needed a source of income. Fast. But out here, miles from civilization, what could a lone woman and a band of children possibly do to earn a living? The land itself held the first clue. It was good land, the soil dark and rich. Samuel had been right about that. Marcus, who had grown up on a farm, knew things. He knew how to read the earth, how to find water. He showed Catherine how to reinforce the cellar, how to dig a proper fire pit that wouldn't fill their living space with smoke. Rebecca, it turned out, had a quiet knowledge of the wild. She knew which plants were medicine and which were food, knowledge learned at her mother's side. Lucy could cook anything over an open fire, turning their meager rations into something that felt like a meal. They were a fractured, broken little group, but together they had a surprising collection of skills. They were survivors. All of them. Their first stroke of luck came from an unexpected direction. Dr. William Hayes, Kearney's only physician, rode out to the homestead one afternoon. He was a kind, weary man in his 50s, his face a roadmap of long nights and difficult cases. He'd heard their story from the Parkers and had come to check on the children. As he examined them, his professional eye caught Rebecca's quiet competence. She anticipated what he needed, handing him supplies, her movements deft and sure. He watched her clean and bandage a cut Michael got while chopping wood, her touch gentle but firm. "That girl," he said to Catherine later, his voice thoughtful. "She has the gift." But he hadn't just come to offer medical advice. He had a proposition. "Miss Walsh," he began, "this territory is growing faster than I can keep up. There are families homesteading 20, 30 miles northeast of here. When they get sick, when a child is born, it's a full day's ride for me to get to them, and a full day back. Sometimes I don't get there in time." He paused, looking around at the ruins, then at the determined set of Catherine's jaw. "I need a way station, a place between Kearney and the outer homesteads where a traveler can rest, where I can store medical supplies, where someone can provide basic care in an emergency until I can arrive." He looked her straight in the eye. "I can't pay much, a small monthly stipend, but I would provide you with a full medical kit, teach you the essentials, setting bones, stitching wounds, delivering babies. You'd be providing a vital service, and you'd have an income." It was a lifeline, a terrifying, overwhelming lifeline. Delivering babies? Setting bones? She was a textile worker from Philadelphia. But then she looked at the 8 children watching her, their futures hanging on her answer. She thought of Joshua's fever a few nights before, how helpless she had felt. This wasn't just about money, it was about knowledge, the power to protect them. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, we'll do it." Dr. Hayes spent the next week teaching her. He was a patient, thorough instructor, drilling her on anatomy, on recognizing symptoms, on the grim but necessary work of a frontier medic. Rebecca watched every lesson, her eyes wide, absorbing everything like a sponge. They worked with a desperate urgency, expanding the root cellar, building partitions from salvaged lumber, and using the stones from the old chimney to build a proper hearth. They were creating a home, not from plans and fresh timber, but from the rubble of a tragedy. Their first customer arrived before they were even ready. A young homesteader named Frank Stevens, his face pale with panic, rode up one night in a driving rain. His wife, Martha, was in labor with their first child. Something was wrong. The baby was breech, and they were miles from town. He'd been riding for Dr. Hayes when he saw their lamp, a tiny beacon of light in the vast, stormy darkness. Catherine's blood ran cold. She had read about this in Dr. Hayes' books, but she'd never seen it. This was real, a woman's life, and her babies were in her hands. She looked at Frank's terrified face, and she saw her own desperation reflected there. "Bring her inside," she said, her voice betraying none of the terror she felt. The next 12 hours were a trial by fire. The cellar was cramped and hot, the air thick with tension. Rebecca was at her side, a silent, steady presence. Boiling water, preparing cloths, her calm a counterpoint to Catherine's racing heart. The other children huddled in a corner, watching in wide-eyed silence. It was the hardest thing Catherine had ever done. But as the sun rose, painting the prairie in hues of pink and gold, the cellar was filled with a new sound, the healthy, angry cry of a newborn baby girl. Martha Stevens, exhausted but radiant, clutched her daughter. "You saved us," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're a miracle." Frank pressed $2 silver into Catherine's hand. It was more money than she'd seen in months. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the look in his eyes, a look of profound, undying gratitude. They had done it. They had turned a place of death into a place of life. Words spread like a prairie fire. The story of the lone woman and her adopted children, of the way station that had appeared in the middle of nowhere, of the miracle baby born in a root cellar during a storm. People started coming. A rancher with a broken arm, a trapper with a nasty infection. Families caught in early snowstorms, seeking shelter. With every person they helped, their supplies grew. The rancher paid with a milking cow. The trapper paid with smoked meats and furs. Families left behind flour, sugar, blankets. Their desperate gamble was paying off. They were not just surviving, they were becoming essential. They were building a community around them, one act of kindness at a time. But their growing success was a double-edged sword. A light that shines in the darkness doesn't just attract those who are lost, it also attracts the wolves. One evening in late December, with the snow piled high outside, 3 men rode up to the homestead. They were rough-looking, their eyes cold and watchful. They claimed to be prospectors whose wagon had broken down, and they asked for shelter for the night. Catherine's instincts screamed at her. There was no broken wagon. Their story felt thin, rehearsed. She let them in. Turning away travelers in a blizzard was a death sentence. But she was on high alert. Marcus felt it too. He sat by the fire, sharpening his old knife, his eyes never leaving the strangers. Late that night, Catherine was woken by a floorboard creaking. She opened her eyes to a nightmare. One of the men was standing over her, a knife in his hand, its blade glinting in the firelight. Another was going through their medical supplies, pocketing the precious laudanum and surgical tools. The third stood by the door, a pistol in his hand. "Not a sound, lady," the man above her hissed. "Just tell us where you keep the money people pay you. We know you're doing good business out here." Fear, cold and absolute, threatened to paralyze her. But then she saw him move toward the corner where the children slept. He reached a hand out towards little Emma, and the fear vanished, replaced by a rage so pure, so primal, it was like lightning in her veins. She wasn't Catherine Walsh, the mail-order bride from Philadelphia anymore. She was a mother bear, and someone was threatening her cubs. With a scream that was more animal than human, she lunged, not away from the knife, but toward it, grabbing the man's wrist with both hands. The blade sliced her palm, but she barely felt it. At the same moment, Marcus exploded into action, launching himself from the shadows and driving his own rusted knife into the man's leg. The man howled in pain and surprise. The gunman at the door spun around, raising his pistol, but he was too late. From the other side of the room, a heavy cast-iron skillet, swung by 12-year-old Lucy, crashed against the side of his head. He crumpled to the floor. The third man, seeing his companions fall, stared in disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be easy targets. A helpless woman and a bunch of kids. He turned and fled into the blizzard, leaving his partners behind. In the sudden, panting silence, Catherine stood over the groaning man on the floor, her hand bleeding, her chest heaving. The children were awake, their eyes wide with shock and adrenaline. But they weren't crying. Rebecca was already getting bandages. Michael was helping Marcus tie up the conscious intruder. They had faced down the wolves and won. As Catherine bandaged her own hand, she looked at the two captured men, now bound and helpless. She felt no pity, only a cold, hard resolve. They had reminded her of a vital lesson. It wasn't enough to build a sanctuary. You had to be strong enough to defend it. The next day, Tom Parker and a group of homesteaders arrived, having been alerted by a signal fire they'd prearranged. They took the prisoners back to Kearney to face justice. But the incident left a permanent mark. The outside world was dangerous, and it would come for them again. They spent the rest of the winter preparing. Marcus taught everyone, even 7-year-old Sarah, how to load and fire the rifle Frank Stevens had left as a gift. They mapped out defensive positions. They set up warning systems. Their home was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress. But even as they prepared for a physical threat, a more insidious danger was emerging. A story was taking shape, cobbled together from the whispers of travelers and the drunken boasts of the captured intruders. A story about the men who had destroyed the homesteads. They weren't just random raiders. They were an organized gang, and they had a leader, a ruthless man who called himself Colonel Wade. One day, a traveling merchant, grateful for shelter during a storm, shared a piece of gossip he'd heard in a saloon 100 miles away. "This Colonel Wade," the merchant said, lowering his voice, "they say he's not just after money. They say he's settling a score, something about a family dispute, something about a brother who he believed cheated him out of an inheritance." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. The merchant continued, oblivious. "Yeah, funny thing. I heard someone say this colonel's real last name. Same as that fella who used to own this place. Morrison." The room went silent. The crackling of the fire was the only sound. Wade Morrison, Samuel's brother. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The vindictiveness of the attack, the personal rage. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was a fratricide. Samuel hadn't been killed by strangers. He had been murdered by his own brother. And she, Catherine Walsh, had claimed the land. The land Wade Morrison believed was his. She had built a thriving enterprise on it. She had become a beacon of hope, a pillar of the community right on the piece of earth he had killed for. She wasn't just an obstacle. She was an insult. And Wade Morrison was still out there. His gang was still riding. He knew who she was. He knew where she was. And he knew she and the children were witnesses to his crime. He wasn't just going to come back for the money. He was coming back to finish the job. He was coming to wipe every last trace of his brother and anyone connected to him off the map. He was coming to burn her sanctuary to the ground, with all of them inside it. The spring of 1879 did not bring relief. It brought the certainty of a coming war. The prairie bloomed with wildflowers, but Catherine saw only open fields of fire. The sky was a brilliant, endless blue, but she scanned it constantly for the dust cloud of approaching riders. Fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. But she couldn't let the children see it. For them, she had to be a rock. They had to expand. The root cellar, their sanctuary through the winter, was now a trap. They needed to build above ground, with defensible positions, with clear sight lines. They needed a proper house, a barn, a medical clinic that wasn't a hole in the ground. The money they had earned, saved so carefully, was now a war chest. Catherine rode into Kearney, not as a desperate refugee, but as an employer. She hired a crew of builders, led by a stoic Swedish immigrant named Anders Peterson, a man who had lost his own family to typhoid and saw in Catherine a kindred spirit of stubborn survival. You're building a fort, Miss Walsh, Anders remarked one day, looking at her plans. I'm building a home, Mr. Peterson, she corrected him gently. A home that no one will ever take from us. The children worked alongside the builders. Marcus, now 15, was as strong as any man, his quiet leadership earning the respect of the entire crew. Rebecca's medical knowledge was becoming truly formidable. She wasn't just assisting anymore. She was diagnosing, treating, and her instincts were rarely wrong. Dr. Hayes began talking about sending her back east, to a real medical college in Philadelphia. The thought of sending one of her flock so far away was painful, but the pride was immense. A daughter of the prairie, a survivor of a massacre, was going to become a doctor. It was a victory against the darkness that had tried to consume them, but the darkness was gathering. Whispers grew louder. Wade Morrison's gang was getting bolder, hitting homesteads and stagecoaches across the territory. They were organized, disciplined, and utterly without mercy, and their path was circling, ever closer, back towards Plum Creek, back towards Samuel's land. The warning came on a hot afternoon in late June. Frank Stevens rode in, his horse lathered, his face grim. He'd been in a saloon in a rail town to the west and had overheard some of Morrison's men. They were talking about you, Catherine, he said, his voice low and urgent. They called this place the Miracle Homestead. They were laughing about it, about how a little mail-order bride and a bunch of orphans got rich on Wade's land. They know about the money. They know about the medical supplies. They think you have a vault in here. He took a deep breath. They're coming. A dozen men, maybe more. They're planning to hit you within the week, and they're not planning on leaving anyone alive to tell the tale. That night, Catherine gathered her family in the main room of the nearly completed house. The smell of fresh sawn pine filled the air. Lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. She looked at the faces of her children. Marcus, no longer a boy, but a young man with a man's burdens in his eyes. Lucy and Rebecca, on the cusp of womanhood, their childhood stolen but replaced with a strength that awed her. The younger ones, their trauma still visible but now overlaid with a sense of security, a sense of belonging, a sense of home. She told them everything, about Wade Morrison, about Samuel, about the threat that was coming for them. She gave them a choice. We can run, she said, her voice steady. We can pack what we can carry, ride for Kearney, and disappear. We can change our names, start over somewhere new where no one knows us. She let the words hang in the air. Then she met Marcus's eyes. Or, she said, her voice dropping to a steely whisper, we can stay. We can make our stand. We can fight for this piece of earth, for this home that we have built with our own hands, with our own blood and tears. It was Marcus who answered, but his voice spoke for them all. He stood up, and in the lamplight, he seemed to grow taller. His hand rested on the new rifle that leaned against his chair. We're not running, he said, his voice a low growl. This is our home. He already took one family from me. He's not getting another. A chorus of agreement went around the room. Not a single voice of dissent, not a flicker of doubt. The fear was there. She could see it in their eyes. But something else was there too, a fierce, unyielding resolve. They were a family forged in fire, and they would not be broken. All right then, Catherine said, a grim sense of pride swelling in her chest. Let's get ready for a war. The next few days were a whirlwind of frantic, focused preparation. Anders Peterson and his crew, upon hearing the news, refused to leave. We built this house, Miss Walsh, Anders said, his jaw set. We will help you defend it. They turned the homestead into a death trap. They boarded up windows, leaving small slits for firing. They dug trenches. They positioned Anders and his men in the newly built barn, creating a deadly crossfire. They stockpiled ammunition, water, and medical supplies in the house. The root cellar, their first home, was prepared as a final fallback position, a place for the youngest children to shelter if the main house was breached. Catherine walked the perimeter every night, checking every position, going over the plan again and again. She felt a strange calm settle over her. The terror of the unknown was gone, replaced by the cold calculus of combat. She had come to Nebraska looking for a quiet life, for a partner to share the burdens. Instead, she had become a general on the eve of battle, responsible for a dozen lives, her own included. She thought of Samuel, the man she never met. Had he been a good man, caught in his brother's web of evil? Or was he more complicated? She would never know. His story was over. Hers was about to reach its climax. On the morning of the fifth day, as the sun began to burn the mist off the prairie, Sarah, who was on watch in the attic, called down. Her voice was high and tight with tension. "They're coming!" Catherine grabbed her rifle and ran to the window. On the horizon, a line of riders. 10, 11, 12 of them. They moved with a confident, swaggering purpose, spreading out as they approached, a pack of wolves closing in on the fold. At their head rode a large man on a black horse. Even from this distance, she could feel the menace radiating from him. Wade Morrison. She took a deep breath, the smell of gunpowder and fear filling her lungs. "Positions, everyone," she called out, her voice ringing through the house. "Hold your fire until I give the word. And remember what we're fighting for." She looked around the room, at the determined faces of her children, at the grim-faced builders clutching their rifles. They were not a bunch of victims. They were the defenders of Walsh Homestead, and they were ready. The riders stopped 100 yards from the house. Wade Morrison trotted forward alone, a dirty white cloth tied to his saddle, a mocking parody of a truce flag. "You in the house!" he bellowed, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I'm Colonel Wade Morrison. This is my land you're squatting on. You've had your fun. Now you pack your brats and your things and you get out. Leave the money and the medical supplies and I might just let you live." Catherine stepped out onto the front porch, her rifle held loosely in her hands. She wanted him to see her. She wanted him to see the woman who had undone all his plans. "This land doesn't belong to you, Mr. Morrison," she called back, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the open ground. "You have no authority here. You are a thief and a murderer, and this is as far as you go." His face, which had been a mask of smug confidence, twisted into a snarl of pure rage. The pretense was over. "Wrong answer, you stubborn witch!" he screamed, wheeling his horse around. "Burn it! Burn it all! Kill every last one of them!" As he galloped back to his men, Catherine raised her rifle to her shoulder, took a steadying breath, and sighted down the long barrel at the man on the black horse. "Now," she whispered, and the prairie exploded with the thunder of gunfire. The first volley from the house and barn was devastating. The attackers, expecting a panicked, disorganized defense, rode directly into a coordinated wall of lead. 2 men were knocked from their saddles before they'd gotten halfway to the house. A third screamed as his horse went down, trapping him underneath. The charge faltered, breaking into chaos as the raiders scrambled for cover. "Reload!" Catherine yelled, her voice cutting through the din. The house was filled with the acrid smoke of gunpowder. Beside her, Marcus was firing with a calm, deadly precision, working the lever of his rifle with practiced efficiency. The fight settled into a brutal siege. Morrison's men, recovering from the initial shock, dismounted and began returning fire, their bullets thudding into the thick wooden walls of the house. Glass shattered. Splinters flew through the air. Catherine moved from window to window directing fire, her mind a whirlwind of tactical decisions. She was no longer afraid. There was no room for fear. There was only the fight. Anders and his men in the barn were proving to be the key. Their position created a lethal crossfire, pinning down half of Morrison's force and preventing any organized rush on the house. One of the raiders tried to make a break for the barn with a torch, intending to burn them out. But a single shot from Marcus's rifle dropped him in his tracks. An hour crawled by, then 2. The heat inside the house was stifling, the air thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. One of Anders's men had taken a bullet in the leg, and Rebecca was already out in the trenches, crawling under fire to reach him, her medical bag clutched in her hand. Catherine watched in a mixture of terror and awe as her daughter, a girl who should have been learning needlepoint, expertly applied a tourniquet and packed the wound while bullets whizzed over her head. The tide began to turn when Wade Morrison, enraged by his men's failure, decided to lead a charge himself. Rallying 4 of his remaining fighters, he stormed toward the back of the house, a weak point they had identified. They used a heavy log as a battering ram, smashing it against the reinforced kitchen door. The wood groaned, then splintered. "They're breaking through!" Lucy screamed from the kitchen. Catherine ran, grabbing a heavy axe from the woodpile. "Marcus, keep them pinned from the front," she yelled. As the door burst inward, Wade Morrison filled the frame, a monstrous silhouette against the bright sunlight, a pistol in each hand. He didn't get a chance to fire. Catherine swung the axe with all the strength in her body. It wasn't an elegant blow, but it was brutally effective. The heavy steel head caught him in the shoulder, shattering his collarbone and sending one of his pistols flying. He roared in pain, staggering back. At the same moment, Lucy, her face a mask of cold fury, emptied a pot of boiling water from the stove directly into the face of the man behind him. He shrieked, clawing at his scalded skin. The other two raiders, seeing their leader down and their comrade screaming, hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. Two shots rang out from the front of the house as Marcus, having repositioned, picked them off through the broken doorway. Wade Morrison lay on the kitchen floor, clutching his shattered shoulder, his face a contortion of agony and disbelief. He looked up at Catherine, who stood over him, the bloody axe held ready. "It's over, Morrison," she said, her voice a low growl. His eyes were filled with a venomous hatred. "This isn't over," he spat through gritted teeth. "I'll come back. I'll—" "No," Catherine said. "You won't." The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fall and their numbers dwindling, lost their nerve. They broke and ran, scrambling for their horses and fleeing across the prairie, leaving their dead and wounded behind. A sudden ringing silence descended upon the homestead, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the distant sound of retreating hoofbeats. Catherine dropped the axe, her arms trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. She stumbled outside into the sunlight. The yard was a scene of carnage. Bodies lay scattered in the grass. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and death. But the house was standing. The barn was standing, and her family was alive. The children began to emerge from the house, their faces smudged with soot, their eyes wide. They had done it. They had faced the monster and they had won. Rebecca was already tending to the wounded, her own and the enemy's, with a dispassionate professionalism that was breathtaking. Dr. Hayes and a posse from Kearney arrived late that afternoon, having been summoned by a rider Catherine had sent at the first sign of attack. They stared at the scene, at the defeated raiders being tied up, at the formidable defenses, and at the woman in the center of it all, her dress torn, her face grimed with smoke, but her eyes blazing with an unquenchable fire. "My God, Catherine," Dr. Hayes said, his voice full of awe. "What have you done here?" Catherine looked at the house they had defended, at the family she had protected. She thought of the long journey that had brought her to this bloody piece of ground. "We held our ground, Doctor," she said simply. "We built a home, and we kept it." News of the Battle of Walsh Homestead, as it came to be called, became the stuff of legend. It wasn't just a story of survival, it was a story of defiance. It sent a shockwave through the territory. The myth of the invincible raider gangs was broken. It turned out they could be beaten, not by the army or the marshals, but by a mail-order bride, a Swedish carpenter, and a family of orphans who refused to run. Wade Morrison and his surviving men were taken to trial. The children, led by Marcus, gave testimony that was chilling in its detail and unwavering in its conviction. The story of Samuel's murder came out, and the full scope of Wade's monstrous greed was laid bare. He was sentenced to hang, but the real victory wasn't in the courtroom, it was on the prairie. Catherine's homestead became a symbol of hope and strength. People started looking to her not just for medical care, but for advice, for leadership. The isolated homesteads began to band together, forming mutual protection pacts inspired by her example. They had learned that survival wasn't just about building strong walls, but about building strong communities. The woman who had come to Nebraska seeking a safe harbor had, in the end, become the harbor master. The years that followed were ones of building, not just of structures, but of a society. The homestead grew into a way station. The way station grew into a settlement. People, drawn by the safety and the sense of community, began to build their own homes nearby. A church was built, then a school where Sarah, having earned her teaching certificate, became the first schoolmistress. The settlement needed a name. No one had any doubt what it should be called. Walshburg. Rebecca returned from Philadelphia, a licensed physician, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, and together she and Catherine established the finest medical facility west of Omaha. Marcus, with his sharp mind and natural authority, became the town's first mayor, his business ventures bringing a railroad spur and prosperity to the entire region. The other children found their own paths, each a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Catherine Walsh, the spinster from Philadelphia, became the matriarch of a dynasty and the founder of a town. She never remarried. She said she'd had a family, the one she had chosen, the one she had fought for, and that was enough. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, she would sit on the porch of her house, the same house that had once been a fortress, and look out over the lights of the town that bore her name. She would think of the terrified woman who had stepped off the train all those years ago, a woman who believed her life was over. She had been so wrong. Her life hadn't been over. It hadn't even begun. She had come looking for a home, a simple, quiet place to live out her days. But the frontier had other plans. It had tested her, broken her, and then forged her into something new. It had taken everything from her, and in return, had given her a purpose, a family, and a legacy written not in letters of ink, but in the timber and stone of a thriving town, and in the lives of the countless people she had saved. The smoke that had once risen from the ashes of a tragedy had been replaced by the warm hearth smoke of 1,000 homes, a testament to the mail-order bride who expected a husband, but found a destiny instead. If you were moved by Catherine's journey of courage and resilience, there are two more incredible stories of survival waiting for you right on your screen. They're a testament to the strength of the human spirit, and I promise you won't want to miss them. Go ahead and click one to keep the adventure going. And if you haven't already, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell. It's the best way to make sure you never miss another story from our corner of the world.